So I'm actually reminded of what a Spanish novelist I like very much said in one of his books, that we only see in books what we already have in ourselves. So I think we each read books differently according to what we care about and what we know. So of course my reading is complementary rather than different perhaps. And I really did sympathize with the idea of thinking about the differences or similarities between North and South, and stop, and this is part of what my own work has been dealing with as well, not assume that North America is profoundly different than South America, not assume that their colonial past is profoundly different, but rather interrogate and see what is different and what's similar, and discovering many more similarities than we have imagined in the past. I also sympathize the idea of looking at history rather, as you say, from east to west, from south to north. And for a while I had on my door in the office, I used to work at Stanford, a map of the Americas upside down, which came out in The Economist, with Latin America on the top and US on the south, and I thought this was great. So I like that. But I'm also aware of the fact that we could do all these games in other ways too. We could do a north to south history of the US that will stress the French experience in the US. Or we could actually talk about the Caribbean as really the place in which so much of the US was founded upon and grew. And the fact that so many Caribbean countries are not presently part of the US is more a historical hazard than any recent development. So there are many ways to think about the ways we could have changed the way we think about American history if we took elements that are not taken into account right now into play. Nevertheless, you're right that the hegemonic one speaks about the US as an Anglo space. And my question as I was reading your book is why? And I don't think, or I at least didn't find an answer to the book, in the book, of why this happens, which I think is the most interesting question. You're looking to say that it has a Hispanic past by looking at Spanish colonialism in the US, and I actually tend to agree there with David Carrasco, that I'm not sure that we can draw this line between Spain as an imperial power expanding in the Americas to present-day Latino communities. I think there's a lot of things that combine them, but there are a lot of things that distinguish between them quite radically. So I wondered, in your own thinking, how do you convert this imperial past into a Latino present? But even more than that, I wanted to ask you, what do you think happened? Why did this space got so anglicized? And the way I think about it as a historian, and I've been working a little bit on North America too, is of course Anglicization started long before the period you were talking about, in when the Spaniards retreat, or Hispanics retreat, and the Anglo advance, because the first Anglicization happens in the eastern seaboard colonies, where you have a plethora of immigrants from other countries, not England, that are being anglicized. And there's a lot of research now asking how come? How did the Dutch, right? The Puritans we take for symbols of the US, we now know we're not English, they were all Dutch, right? They came on this famous ship we all take as an example for US, but they were Dutch refugees. How did these Dutch, Swedes, French eventually become Anglophiles? I think is the first question. And then why, when these people expand, they Anglophile the rest of the country? And you refer to it a little bit when you talk about how Texas, which was Spanish, and then Mexican, loses out to these colonialists that come from other parts and Anglicize Texas. But I think since it happens everywhere, it happens in the seaboard colonies first, and then it happens everywhere else where other peoples have colonized, including natives, including with blacks, including with those who were vestiges of Spanish presence, might be questions why. What is so powerful in this culture or this way of being that allowed this development elsewhere? And that actually combines to another question I had to the book, which is how do we distinguish a region from their developments? Because I think the book speaks a lot about the origins, the Spanish origins of the US, but not so much what happens next. How do regions become into a process, development, and then consequences? Why did, in fact, these places that were Spanish ended up not being Spanish? And I don't think it's just political power, economic power. There's much more that is there. So I was thinking even about your example. There is an example in the book in which Professor Fernández-Armesto speaks about asking people who are interviewing for a job in colonial North America, which was the first territory currently belonging to the US that was colonized by Europeans, and they give all kinds of answers. Some mention Florida, some mention other ex-Hispanic territories, but none mentions Puerto Rico, which is indeed the first to be colonized. But of course, when I was reading it as a historian, my question was why? Why didn't they mention Puerto Rico? I think your answer is prejudice, but my question is that really people here do not think of Puerto Rico as part of the US. And not for prejudice, but because it's not a state, because it has this weird status that we don't know what it is, which it is, and it isn't part of the US. And I was actually astounded so many people said Florida. I think it does mean that individuals in the US have the sense of the Hispanic past of the US today. I think it's not true a generation ago. So I think your book would have been much more revolutionary had it been written 2 generations ago than today, but I think today it is. But as I was looking at reviews of the book, there were 2 that I think were asking the same question, and I wanted to mention them. There is one by Héctor Tobar, which I assume has some Hispanic or Latino, I don't know, in Los Angeles Times, that actually asks also the same question I'm asking about origins, the Spanish origins versus the presence, and the question of Anglicization of these territories. And he says, Santa Fe is now part of the US, and its government and legal institution are descendants of the 13 colonies. If you grow up in Santa Fe and your last name is Vigil or Longoria, you have as much right to claim Tom Paine, the Bill of Rights, and Jeffersonian ideas as your own as someone called Jones or Smith. And if you grow up speaking Spanish in Los Angeles, Martin Luther King is definitely more relevant to your personal history than 17th century Spanish monarch Carlos II. There is another person in another review that actually that is much more extreme in his expression of, I think, the same idea, of says the history of Hispanics North America is fascinating as the book shows, yet it is also clear that it is story of something that ended up in the periphery. And then he says, America is a country founded on a unique set of ideas, and most of them do not come from imperial Spain. So I think the real question to ask is not so much the presence of a colonial power like Spain here as the presence of a French colonial power and other colonial powers, but really the question of in what moment is this process of losing whatever there was happened, not the origin but the process, and how do you explain it? In your own book it seems a little bit like war, because you speak about retreats with war. It sounds like war. So David was reading religion. I'm a legal historian, I read war. So there is a status quo, equilibrium, then Spanish retreat, then counter-colonization. I heard it as a confrontation, but of course I would think that things are much more sophisticated. This morning I was teaching a class on American law as part of European law, and we were speaking about how California ended up adopting common law. And we were looking at the debates in California, which had a Spanish law, in which people were debating whether to maintain the Spanish law or change it to common law. And it's a very, very long process, and there are committees, and there are debates, and eventually there is a reason why the common law is adopted. You can, whoever is interested, I'm willing to tell you the story. But it's quite clear that there is a transition, there is a question, there are debates, and eventually things go in a certain way. That has nothing to do with how they began, but it has everything to do with how they end. So I was wondering whether you can tell us a little bit about that. How did you see the link between a Spanish past and a Hispanic or Latino present? And if you can give an explanation of why this Anglicization, I don't know how you say it in English, was such a successful story everywhere. So it's not a place. In a place we can say power relations, economic interest, but it's a general story that, as I say, begins actually with certain colonies. It doesn't begin with the Hispanics. Thank you.
Well, thank you very much.